computer. Beautiful. All right. Let me start sharing again. You guys see my NextAuth backdrop? Cool. All right. Well, let's get rolling. So NextAuth.js is a utility that I found recently that I saw and I liked immediately because it is an abstraction around authentication for Next.js specifically. Now, you know, I know some of you, probably all of you, have implemented authentication in maybe a couple of different formats. And you'll know that if you, at least a while back, if you try to do it from scratch, it can be challenging, especially, if you want to do one-click authentication with, Facebook or anyone else, there's multi-step process, for the handshake and for the, the grabbing the tokens and such. Then there's state management. And then there's OAuth 1 versus OAuth 2. And then it gets even more challenging when you want to use a framework like Next.js, which is both client and server side. As time evolved, there were a lot of different tools for working with it. Like on Ruby on Rails, they had OmniAuth, which integrated with all the most common providers and made it easier. Next.js is a newer framework, and because it's client and server, things like that can take more work because if you log in on your client, well, it doesn't mean the server is authenticated. And if you make an API call, you got to make sure that that person's still authenticated too. So Next.js does all that for you, and at the very least, it's a time saver. Their mention is that it's got an added level of security because they're doing a lot of work on the security, so you don't have to think about it. It's really great. It's extremely flexible. It allows you to, if you take a look at some of their docs, they've got all these authentication providers you can plug into with just a few lines of code. Cognito, Apple, Atlassian, Discord is in here, Facebook, Foursquare, like GitLab. I'm sure somebody uses GitLab these days, especially in the enterprise. Tons and tons and tons. Among that also is email. So you can do magic link login, which I just did an example of in an upcoming blog post. Also, you can work with JWTs or JavaScript web tokens. And basically, like if you want to have your mobile app authenticating with the API portion of the Next.js application, you can set that up using NextAuth too without having to do all the work manually. It's got a bunch of React hooks. So client API is great. All of it works off of this use session hook, and it'll provide you a session if the person's logged in with their profile data, if you're logging into Google or Facebook or Insta or any of those providers. And if they're not logged in, it'll give you a no. There's also a server-side version of a lot of this, like get session, where you can use this in a serverless function to check whether the person's logged in. And then based on that, do a bunch of other stuff. It's also got database integration, which is kind of great. So in your configuration, basically you can enable database storage of session information. And when you're integrating with an external provider for like one-click sign-in, it can synchronize the account data for you into your database. That way you can do, relational joins on any other stuff. So for example, in the photo sharing app that I'm building, I have them integrating with, I think, just Google right now. But because they authenticate with Google, some account information gets saved directly to my database so that when the person is logged in, I don't have to keep making requests against Google. I know because of the state management that NextAuth has, the person's logged in, and I can do joins against their user data matched up with their photo gallery information. So it's all coming through in a nice, clean way. So NextAuth is pretty stable right now. They're at version 3.2. It's pretty great. With that, unless there's any questions, let's just dive into some code. Alrighty, cool. So I'm just going to generate a next app. Let's see. Let's pop over my terminal. So yarn create. This is going to be called NextAuth Lunch and learn. And then just for your ease of viewing, I'm going to open the terminal up in VS Code as soon as this is done. Oops. All right. Goodbye, iTerm, even though I love you. All right, so installation is easy. NextAuth. Their community is pretty active too, by the way. Last night, while I was doing some work on this, I discovered a small CSS bug. Actually, it was in the middle of the day, and one of the maintainers responded to me pretty quickly saying, do you want to open a PR for it? And by the time I could reply to him, somebody else had resolved it. So it was within a couple of hours. Pretty great. Cool. So I'm going to open the docs because I forget some of this, but the process for integrating is pretty straightforward. The main thing you got to do is, you got to create this route right here with this. It's basically a set of dynamic routes used with the spread operator that says like anything under here. If I remember the next.js, the way it works with this dynamic route, it's basically going to pass any of this over to this file. So anything that's under the route, pages API off, this JavaScript file is going to handle it, and it's going to throw all the logic handling and rendering over to NextAuth. So for those of you that remember, anything in pages API in next.js is an API route. So let's see if I type that right. NextAuth.js, and then inside here, I'm going to copy and paste the code. Yeah, JS should be inside. That makes sense. All right. So really straightforward. You're importing a library. You're importing a list of providers, which I'm sure you can import individually if you wanted to for cleanliness sake and lower bundle size. You're exporting an instance, the NextAuth constructor, and you're passing it in a configuration that has a list of providers. In this case, it's just a GitHub provider, which I recommend just trying out if you want to live code with, because one of the things that I found most time consuming when working with this is actually creating API keys for different providers. GitHub is pretty easy. Google is a little more involved only because there's just more options. And I could pull in one for GitHub that I had in another repo, just to save a little time. Let me go here. Actually, I do need iTerm again. Just to find my other repo. This is the one from my Jamstack ebook. I'm going to use the same API credentials just to make life easier. And for starters, all you need is, oh, I don't even have the GitHub one in here. Apologies. I guess in this app, I'm just doing Google, but it's the same process. So when we create a .env, you basically specify the environment variables for the client ID and the client secret. And then in the provider list, you basically say, okay, I want this provider, and these are the environment variables that correspond with it. So this will be Google client ID and Google client secret. This right here, you don't need by default. You don't need to integrate with a database. You do need it when you're authenticating with email, because they need somewhere to store the email and the authentication tokens and all that, which isn't handled by a provider that doesn't exist. So, but by default, you don't need it. Setting up the database takes a little bit more work, and that's covered in my recent blog post, but we can go into that if we have time as well. So this right here does the setup. And the next thing you're going to need, let me just double check that I'm remembering it all, is that basically you can go into the code and start authenticating. Yep. So the use session hook is what does it. So let's go into our index.js. Let's hide this. And let's actually, sorry, start our server, yarn dev, which in next pops it open on localhost 3000. All right, and you got your boilerplate next.js page. I'm just going to gut this so we can see exactly what we want to see in here. And we don't need the head content. It's going to have an H1, nothing else in it. All right, boom. So I'm going to import. One gotcha is you don't want to import it from NextAuth by itself. If you do that, I forget what it actually says. But yeah, you'll get this. Can't resolve SS, which isn't the most useful error in the world. But it's basically because we're importing from the wrong package. You need to get it from NextAuth client. Even if you're doing this in an API route, because the client library has, it's the authentication client. It's not necessarily for the client side of your application. Whether you're using a React component or a serverless function in Next.js, NextAuth client is the library that you want to pull everything from. Okay, so then we're not throwing any errors. And then and I forget whether this is expanded out or not. We got to destructure it. Let's see. No, it is expanded out. So session and loading is what we get from this hook. All right, the loading parameter is optional. Session is the only one that you really need. But you can use loading, or actually, let's just start without it. So let's say, let's give it a session and you are logged in. Okay, not session. You are not logged in. Oops. Let's give it a bold for emphasis. All right. Okay, boom. We're obviously not logged in by default. NextAuth is also going to give us sign in and sign out hooks. Not logged in. Let's log in here. And we're going to need a link, actually. Let's see. Actually, let's do this as a button. No link. Let's do that. Okay. Let's see. JSON. We need a closing tag, of course. As you can see, I'm not getting super fancy with my HTML right now. All right, log in here. So just by passing this little hook right here, it's not even a hook, it's just a method that triggers the necessary APIs in here. It's going to bump us, or is it not? Ooh. What was that about? Let's see that error. Client fetch error. Unexpected token E JSON bad request. Let's take a look. Ah. Oh, interesting. Interesting. I guess that might be new. Previously, we were able to call it just as an event handler, but I guess you have to use an arrow function. It doesn't quite make sense to me. Well, that is very new. Okay. Let's see. Sign in, sign out, use session.
Does it have to do with the href that you've given it?
Maybe. Let's see, click the button. I mean, it really shouldn't matter. So this is actually coming up right away. Oh, this is probably, well, so the use session hook is looking for this by default. So this is calling to check to see whether you're logged in or not. So I'm not sure why this is coming up as such. Oh, okay. Probably because I didn't put in the next.auth URL environment variable. I guess I did forget that. So it does need this, it needs an absolute URL. I didn't realize it needed it just to get going. I know it needs it for a callback, but I guess it needs it to even work from the beginning. So because I have an environment variable change, I'm just going to restart my dev server. And then let's see if that resolved that error. It's still giving a bad request. Yeah, it's odd. Let's take a look. Let's start from the beginning again. Let's make sure nothing's happening just by virtue of including the library. Session is definitely not defined. Oh yeah, that's right. We're using session right here. Okay. So use session and sign in should be working okay. And then oops. NextAuth environment variables are already in there. Let me double check my other repo. I wonder if I know at one point I had to actually expose this to next.js. I'm not sure if that's the reason this is happening though. No, it's not it. It's not the URL. Okay, 3000. Let me see if I configured this file incorrectly. Oh yes, I think I missed the directory. Hold on. So pages, yes, pages API auth. You actually have to create an auth folder. That's a bit of a gotcha. I actually ran into that before and I completely forgot about it. I wish they'd call it out a little more in the doc. I might make that a recommendation for that. Okay, cool. Now our session is succeeding successfully, and it's just returning a blank JSON object because we're not signed in. Cool. So now back to the code. With this sign-in function, and actually this should work now, actually without the arrow function. All this is going to do, it's going to redirect us to the default sign-in page, which now is dying because of the, actually, no, this is fine, yes. This is the default sign-in page. There's a bug that this isn't a bug, but by default, they will have a configuration setting that will inherit the theme of these pages from your operating system theme, which is cool. So I'm using a dark system theme and it's inheriting it in this page. The only problem is it's not doing it across the rest of my site. So Next.js is defaulting to light. So normally what I'll do in the configuration lately is set theme to light, just for consistency while developing. And a reload will fix that. And then you could do whatever you want with it later on. So already, like with this, as long as I've got the right API credentials, GitHub authentication or Google authentication is pretty much effectively set up. Let's just make sure that it works. Try signing in with a different account. All right, let's try with this one. All right, we're logged in. That's the basics. So it's pretty much how you connect it to any like standard provider, all the common ones, social media networks and such. next, you want to do something with it, obviously, because now that you've got all this information, why not? So if you take a look, this is what the session object looks like. You got user information, my Cavaliere, email, image. So if I wanted to, I could start displaying these when the person is logged in. So session in, logged in. Let's do this. In fact, let's put a container in there. Let's get a next.js image component. Oops. Actually, it might be a default export. Let's do that. Session. I'll say source of the attribute. And then session.user.image. Forget what parameter this needs, and I'm sure it'll tell me if I'm wrong. Whoops. Oh yeah, I love this about Next.js where you get the little error pop up. Let's see, it needs width or height or layout equals fill. Let's do a width and a height. Going on. Invalid source prop. Oh, it looked like a URL to me. Let's see. User image. Oops. Yep, that's definitely an image. Let's look it up. Let me know if I'm going too fast or too slow or anything. To me, it feels fine, but it's all about you guys. Source. Okay. Should be fine. Invalid source prop. Next image. Hostname. Oh, okay. Next.js config. You need a hostname configured. Cool. So you just got to create a next config. This is the next thing, which makes sense for security reasons. You probably don't want your app by default to include images from just about anywhere. Let's see what that domain was. And then we'll have to restart the server. Actually, yes. Next.js tells you that. Found a change in next config. Let's do that. Oops, wrong page. Boom, logged in. Let's put my name under there too. And I want to say that the properties that are returned in that session object might differ based on the provider and the settings that your app has, the permissions that your app has requested. But I haven't really played around with the data that you get back from there. As of now, I've done Google and GitHub and maybe one other, and I've just gotten back the same basic info, but I'm sure it's configurable on some level. Those are the basics. Then another thing you'll typically want to do is, oh yeah, log out, obviously. Let's go sign out. Let's do this text here. Okay, because it's Next.js, it's pretty fast. This page, you'll notice by default, it's styled a certain way. So normally the next thing you want to do is customize it. The sign-in page, there's like an expiration token page, and there's a bunch of pages that are included as boilerplate by default. So if you look at configuration pages, these are all the pages in there. And so if you want to style one custom, you just got to specify it in this object, and you grab the boilerplate code that they have and start doing it. So if I go in here, let's say I want to customize the sign-in page, which is the one we're on. I'm going to go sign in /auth sign in. And then I'm going to create pages. I'm going to create the auth directory again, which is that same gotcha. If you don't do it, you're going to be confused like I was. And then you get the code for the default sign in, which is this. And by default, what it does is you can pull in the list of providers. It can list them out dynamically and put whatever rendering you want on for each of the providers. And then what I did in my other application is I just wrapped some content around it. So this is just the raw one. You know, you want to put in headings and layouts and application layouts, you can put it around there. Or if you put it in your app.js in Next, it's automatically going to be included. So if I go with this, there it goes here. Containing div or a fragment. And you're going to get that. In Next.js, just as an FYI, there's plenty of ways to do this without putting it in your entire application. You can put multiple page layouts and just wrap each individual page on it. But this is all just to say that this is how we customize the different pages in NextAuth. And where did the screen go? So the other pages, I think new user is basically, this is a way to separate sign in from sign up. That I haven't experimented with yet, but it's obviously a good, or arguably a good user experience option for it. It's definitely simpler with one page for both, but some apps prefer messaging for either of those. This I think is for the check email message. So they give you ways when you do set up email sign up to customize the email templates as well. And they recommend under the email sign up, there's like a new or newish, I guess, I just haven't used it, a responsive email templating library. Let's see, we go to providers, email. There's email. Sign in with email. Here we go. They have email provider documentation, which tells you how to set up the database tables. Where did it go? There we go. And they've got this email library that they recommend, which is MJML. I haven't tried it yet, but it supposedly makes it easy to create responsive email, which is awesome. Oh, also, this is really important. So one really powerful thing about NextAuth is the ability to customize the different lifecycle events. So they've got this notion of callbacks and events. And I forget what the difference is, but I think I've used both. Callbacks are something that, let's see. Callbacks, I think, wrap around an event and let you handle how the framework utilizes them. And the events, I think, are just things that you say, make this happen when this happen. Let's see. Events are they do not return a response that's useful for live reporting yet. So if you want to customize the behavior of these actions within Next.js, like adding more data to the request. So like, for example, like when I was talking about when we sign in with Google, by default, we just get email and the person's name. If you want to add more information, you can do that here. I think these callbacks essentially are pulling information from the provider. So the payload returns, so the session one, for example, returns session and user by default. You can probably make the user a little bit bigger and return more information with that. Let me take a look at my ebook, see what I did in there. I can't remember it. So I got some code over here for it. So on sign in, this is the session event, this is the session callback, and this is the sign in event. So in the session callback, yeah, I'm getting a full user object. So I'm basically saying the session object already has a lot more information in it. That's just not getting returned by default. So if you look at the default callback for session, it's just returning the session object. It's not returning all the user info. So here I'm saying return everything that's in the session object and the user itself. That way I can pull a bunch more data with it. Likewise, in the sign-in event, so this sign-in event is just getting fired off whenever the person signs in. I'm firing an additional API call that I've created. And what that's going to do is it's going to send the user information, and it's going to add certain information about that user to the database so that I can do more information, do more manipulation of it and joins when I'm returning the photo galleries and such. So that's the difference between callbacks and sessions. This is going to change the behavior of the different life cycle events that they have and return whatever you want with it. This here is just going to get called whenever one of these events happens, and it could do whatever you want without changing the flow of authentication. That's pretty much it. Any questions?
Nice, Mike. I was curious myself, when you were building out some of those sign in, sign out pages and they had the code, were those actual pages that were gonna be built like with HTML around it and be styled, or was that more of a component that was like a sign in button component that you were utilizing there?
Oh, so the code that I get from them that you copy and paste looks just like this, and it's basically a React component.
Okay.
It's the same as like if in Next.js, if you ever created a page, you basically are just returning a React component, like a functional component, and which is going to render out whatever the page should have in it.
Boom. Okay.
It's the
cool.
same thing here.
Okay. And so then, would it be there where you could add additional providers if you wanted to, other than the Google one you had?
No, you do that in the configuration. Keep in mind, like the separation of responsibilities. These pages are for rendering out the pages and the interactions within the pages. This right here is populating the page with the relevant data that's coming from the context, which includes the list of providers. But you specify the list of providers here. So if you want to put in like GitHub or Facebook or whatever, you pop it all right in here.
Perfect. Cool.
There's also plenty of configuration options. If you look at, let's see, configuration, there's a debug option, there's the database option. You can use a specialized secret string. This I never used, I don't even know. This is configuration options for the session, whether it's UTF-8s, max age. These are like a lot of different like authentication options, but then there's like, okay, here's the pages, here's the callbacks that we were just talking about. Oh, you can specify a different database adapter if you want to. Sorry, did I answer your question, Mickey, before I go off on a tangent?
Yeah, no, definitely. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. When you specify database integration, by default, it uses TypeORM for it, but you can specify Prisma, or I think there's at least one others for like databases. And that means when it's manipulating the database, it can do it however you want. In my Jamstack app that I'm building for the book, Prisma is the one that I'm using just because Prisma is the database ORM that I'm using for my app, that way it keeps it consistent. And then other option debug I use all the time. Theme, cool. Oh yeah, sorry. This is the option I was talking about, light or dark theme. And it's by default set to auto. But lately I've just been setting it to light just for consistency with what Next.js creates by default. And also because my app that I'm building around it doesn't have a light and dark mode yet. But then when you want it to, I'm sure this is going to make it a lot easier to toggle. And there's more security options and yeah. Whole lot of authentication providers. Crazy. Amplify, GitLab, Google. I had never even heard of half of these. Yep, that's all I got. Thanks. Silent applause is amazing. Cool.
Unmuted applause.
Yeah. Cool. Well, I'll kill the recording. Thanks for attending, you guys. And if you do anything with it, let me know how it goes.
Awesome.
Hell yeah. Thanks, Mike.
Anytime.
Peace, y'all.